We think of ourselves as a global species, and we are. You can find people on every continent. But that wasn't always the case. For most of our history, humans lived in one place, Africa. Then groups of them started to walk, they left their home, and stepped into a world that was completely unknown. This wasn't a single trip or a grand expedition with a goal. It was a slow, creeping expansion that took tens of thousands of years. It was a journey made one step at a time by thousands of small family groups, generation after generation. And the challenges they faced are hard for us to even imagine. There were no maps, no guides, no knowledge of what lay over the next hill or across the next river. Every day was a test of survival against a world that was not just indifferent to them, but often actively hostile. Their success was not guaranteed. In fact, failure was the default. Most groups that tried probably died out. The ones who made it, the ones whose blood runs in our veins, faced and overcame a staggering set of obstacles. These challenges shaped them. They shaped their bodies, their minds, their societies. They shaped us. The first and most constant challenge was the world itself. The planet was not a stable, predictable place. We live in a warm, relatively calm period now. They lived in the Ice Age. The climate was volatile. It lurched between cold and slightly less cold. Vast sheets of ice covered much of the northern hemisphere. These glaciers locked up so much water that sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. The land that is now underwater was dry. Britain was connected to Europe. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska. But these land bridges were not friendly imitations. They were brutal, wind-scoured landscapes. The climate was a relentless enemy. A sudden cold snap could wipe out a whole season's worth of plant food. A winter that lasted a few weeks longer than expected meant starvation. A summer flood could wash away your camp and your tools. There was no weather forecast. They had to read the signs in the sky and the wind and the behavior of animals. A mistake in that reading could be fatal. Imagine trying to keep a small child warm through a blizzard with only animal skins and a small fire for protection. Imagine the constant, gnawing cold seeping into your bones for months on end. Beyond the climate, there was the land itself. Geography was a tyrant. Every mountain range was a wall. Every major river was an ocean. They didn't have boats designed for long voyages. Crossing a wide, fast-flowing river was a life-threatening event. Maybe they built a simple raft. Maybe they waited for a dry season when it was shallower, or maybe they just walked along its bank for a generation, looking for a safe place to cross. Or deserts were just as bad. The Sahara was sometimes green, a savanna filled with life. But other times, it was the hyper-arid desert we know today, a deadly barrier of sand and rock. The deserts of the Middle East were another filter, letting only the most resilient or lucky groups pass through. To cross these places, you needed to know where the next water source was, but they were walking into new lands. They didn't know. They had to guess, to follow animal trails and hope they led to water. Many times, they probably didn't. And then there was the new life. Every new ecosystem was an alien world. The plants were different. They had a deep, inherited knowledge of the plants in their African homeland. They knew which roots were good for food, which leaves could be used for medicine, which berries were sweet, and which ones would kill you in hours. In a new land, all that knowledge was useless. Every new plant was a question mark. Is this edible? They had to learn through trial and error. And error meant sickness or death. Someone in the group had to be the first to try a new root or a new berry. It was a gamble every single time. They likely watched what animals ate, but that was no guarantee. A berry that was fine for a bird could be poison for a human. The animals were also completely different. In Africa, they knew the behavior of lions, hyenas, and elephants. They were masters of this environment. But in Europe and Asia, they came face to face with a new cast of creatures. There were woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos, giant cave bears, and saber-toothed cats. These were megafauna, animals far larger and more powerful than what they were used to. How do you hunt a mammoth? A single one could feed a group for weeks, providing meat, fat, hide for shelter, and bones for tools and structures. But getting close to one was incredibly dangerous. It required a new level of planning, cooperation, and courage. They had to invent new hunting techniques on the fly. They had to learn the animal's habits, its weaknesses. The same went for predators. A cave bear was an enormous, powerful carnivore. Competing with it for shelter in a cave was a deadly proposition. They had to be smarter, more coordinated, and more cautious than they had ever been before. The world was full of new monsters, and they had to figure out how to live alongside them, or how to kill them before they were killed themselves. This constant struggle with the environment led to the second great set of challenges, the basics of daily survival. Finding enough calories to power their bodies was a full-time job. It dominated their existence. We think of early humans as great hunters, and they were, but hunting was unreliable. A hunt could fail. An animal could get away. A hunter could get injured. For every successful mammoth hunt, there were probably dozens of smaller, less glorious efforts to find food. They relied heavily on gathering. Women, children, and the elderly would have spent their days searching for anything edible: nuts, seeds, roots, insects, bird eggs, shellfish. This was the steady, reliable source of food that kept the group alive between successful hunts. But in a new land, they had to learn where to look. They had to learn the seasons. When do the nuts ripen here? Where do the edible roots grow? This knowledge was built slowly, painfully, over generations. And finding water was just as critical. A human can't last long without it. In many landscapes, it was a constant search. They had to follow riverbeds, look for signs of underground springs, and learn how to collect morning dew or rainwater. A reliable water source was the anchor for their lives, a place they might return to again and again. To leave that source and walk into the unknown was a monumental risk. They were walking away from life, hoping to find it again somewhere else. Shelter was another constant need. In a warm climate, you can get by with minimal shelter. But as they moved north into colder regions, a good shelter was the difference between life and death. The best option was a natural cave. A cave provided protection from the wind, the rain, the snow, and from predators. But caves were prime real estate. They might already be occupied by bears or hyenas. Kicking those animals out would have been a terrifying battle. Where there were no caves, they had to build. They used whatever materials were available. In the forests of Europe, they might have made simple frames of wood covered in animal hides. On the cold, treeless steppes of Ukraine and Russia, some incredible archaeological sites show shelters made from the bones and tusks of mammoths. These were sophisticated structures requiring immense effort and ingenuity to build. They were not just places to sleep. They were homes. They were the center of social life, the place where they made tools, cooked food, told stories, and raised their children, all huddled around the precious warmth of a fire. Fire was life. The ability to control fire was one of humanity's greatest assets. It gave them warmth in the cold. It allowed them to cook their food, which made it easier to digest and unlocked more nutrients. It kept nocturnal predators at bay. It was a source of light in the darkness, extending their day and allowing them to work on tools or socialize after sunset. But maintaining a fire was a constant chore. You needed fuel. In a dense forest, that was easy. But on an open plain or in a sparsely vegetated area, finding wood was a daily task. They had to carry fire with them, perhaps as smoldering embers wrapped in moss and bark. Letting the fire go out could be a catastrophe. Their tools were their interface with this difficult world. They lived in the Stone Age. Their toolkit was made of stone, bone, wood, and antler. These tools were essential for hunting, butchering animals, processing plants, and making clothes and shelter. A good flint knife was as important as food itself, but they couldn't carry a huge toolbox with them. Their possessions had to be light and portable. This meant they had to make new tools constantly from local materials. When they entered a new region, one of the first tasks was to find a source of good stone. They needed flint, chert, or obsidian stones that would flake in a predictable way to create a sharp edge. A good quarry was a vital resource. But what if the local stone was poor quality? They had to adapt. They had to change their techniques. Maybe they relied more on bone and antler for tools. Their survival depended on this technological flexibility, this ability to look at a new landscape and see its potential for creating the tools they needed to live. Beyond the external struggles with the environment and survival, there were internal, biological challenges. One of the most dangerous was disease. Every region of the world has its own unique set of local pathogens, bacteria, viruses, and parasites. A population that lives in one place for a long time develops some level of immunity to its local diseases. The people who survived passed on their resistance to their children. When a small band of migrants entered a new land, they were walking into a minefield of new germs. Their immune systems had never encountered these pathogens before. A disease that might only be a mild illness for a local animal population could be devastating to them. They also brought their own African diseases with them, which could have wreaked havoc on the native animal populations they encountered. It was a two-way street of biological warfare, and they were incredibly vulnerable. And then there was the matter of other people. The world outside of Africa was not empty. Other kinds of humans already lived there. In Europe and the Middle East, they met the Neanderthals. In Asia, they met the Denisovans. These were not primitive ape-like creatures. They were our cousins, other intelligent, tool-using hominins who had adapted to these cold lands for hundreds of thousands of years. The encounter between our species, Homo sapiens, and these other humans is one of the most fascinating and complex parts of our story. It was probably not a simple case of war and conquest. The process was likely much more complicated, drawn out over thousands of years. There was almost certainly competition. Both groups needed the same resources, the same caves for shelter, the same herds of animals for food, the same patches of edible plants. In a world of scarcity, this competition could have been violent. Our ancestors may have had advantages. Perhaps their tools were more efficient, or their social networks were larger and more complex, allowing them to cooperate in bigger groups. Perhaps their use of language was more sophisticated, allowing for better planning and knowledge sharing. But there was more than just competition. We know this because we carry their ghosts inside us. Modern human DNA in people of non-African descent contains a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. People from some parts of Asia and Oceania have Denisovan DNA as well. This is undeniable proof that our ancestors didn't just fight with these other humans. They also interbred with them. We can only speculate what these encounters were like. Were they peaceful meetings born of curiosity? Were they violent, with women being taken from one group to another? Were they arranged alliances between different groups? It was probably all of the above at different times and in different places. This interbreeding may have given the newcomers a crucial advantage. By mixing with Neanderthals, for example, our ancestors might have picked up genes that were already adapted to the local diseases in the lower levels of sunlight in the north. It was a genetic shortcut, a way to quickly gain adaptations that had taken the Neanderthals millennia to evolve. But it also meant navigating a complex social world, one where you had to deal with beings who were like you but also distinctly different. The internal social world of the migrant group itself was another major challenge. These were small, close-knit bands of maybe 20 to 50 people. Everyone knew everyone else. Your survival depended on the person next to you. This required an incredible level of social cohesion and cooperation. But the stress of their lifestyle must have been immense. The constant danger, the hunger, the cold. These conditions could easily lead to conflict. How did they resolve disputes? How did they make decisions? Who led the group? It was likely a very fluid, egalitarian system. The best hunter might lead the hunt. The person with the most knowledge of plants might lead the gathering expedition. The oldest and wisest members might be consulted for important decisions. They had to maintain a delicate balance between individual needs and the good of the group. A single selfish or disruptive person could endanger everyone. The evolutionary pressure for cooperation, for empathy, for the ability to understand and get along with others was intense. This is the furnace that forged our social nature. Caring for the vulnerable was also a huge challenge. What do you do with someone who has a broken leg? What about an elderly person who can't keep up anymore? What about a mother who's just given birth? In a settled society, the community can support these individuals. But for a group on the move, it was a brutal calculation. Caring for the weak and sick would slow everyone down, putting the whole group at risk. Yet, we have fossil evidence of individuals who survived for years with severe injuries or disabilities. This shows that they didn't always abandon their own. They must have invested a huge amount of effort and resources in caring for each other. This compassion, this commitment to the group, was one of their greatest strengths. Finally, there were the cognitive and psychological challenges. These are the hardest for us to see in the archaeological record, but they may have been the most profound. First, there was the problem of navigation. How did they know where they were going? There were no maps, no compasses, they were walking into a blank slate. They must have been master navigators using natural signs. They would have used the sun and the stars, they would have understood the patterns of wind, the flow of rivers, the seasonal migration of animals. They built up complex mental maps of their territory, and they had to pass this information down to their children. This knowledge was not written down. It was stored in stories, in songs, in the collective memory of the group. Language was the key. Their ability to use complex language to share information was perhaps their single greatest advantage. They could talk about things that were not right in front of them. They could plan for the future. Tomorrow, we will go to the ridge where the deer passed last season. They could warn about dangers. Don't eat the red berries by the river. It made Koro sick. They could teach a child how to knap flint or how to track an animal without having to learn through dangerous real-world experience. Language was their library, their school, their planning committee. It allowed them to build a shared understanding of their world and to work together with unparalleled effectiveness. This ability to share knowledge was vital for the long, multi-generational nature of their migration. The group that first left a valley had no idea what lay 1,000 miles away. But they learned about their immediate surroundings. They passed that knowledge to their children. The next generation pushed a little further, learned a little more, and passed that on. It was a slow accumulation of knowledge, a map being filled in piece by piece over centuries. And what about the psychological burden? Try to put yourself in their shoes. You are standing at the edge of a valley. Your people have never entered. You don't know what's there. You've left behind everything you knew. The graves of your ancestors are far behind you. The world is filled with uncertainty and fear. Every shadow could be a predator. Every unfamiliar sound in the night could be a threat. The risk of starvation is always present. People you love will get sick and die. Your children face a constant barrage of dangers. The level of stress must have been unimaginable, and yet they kept going. What drove them? It was probably a mix of push and pull. They may have been pushed out of their old lands by climate change, by a lack of resources, or by conflict with other groups. And they may have been pulled forward by curiosity, by the desire to see what was over the next hill, by stories of new lands rich with game. They needed to be resilient. They needed to be adaptable. They had to be willing to abandon old ways of doing things that no longer worked and invent new ones. The people who were too rigid, too set in their ways, probably did not survive. The ones who did were the innovators, the problem solvers, the ones who could look at a new challenge and figure out a solution. This process acted as a powerful evolutionary filter. It selected for intelligence, for creativity, for social flexibility. The journey was not a triumphant march of conquest. It was a desperate, dangerous, and often tragic crawl across the face of the planet. It was a story of immense suffering and loss, but it was also a story of incredible courage and ingenuity. The challenges these first migrants faced were the very forces that made us who we are today. Their struggle against the cold pushed them to develop better clothing and shelters. Their struggle against starvation pushed them to become better hunters and more knowledgeable foragers. Their struggle to navigate a new world pushed their minds to create maps and stories. Their struggle to survive as a small group in a hostile world pushed them to become more cooperative, more social, and more reliant on each other. Every time we cooperate on a project, every time we learn a new skill, every time we feel the pull of curiosity about what lies beyond our current horizon, we are echoing the legacy of these ancestors. They faced a world of unknown challenges and found a way not just to survive, but to eventually thrive. They walked out of Africa as one of several human species and ended up as the only one left, spread across every corner of the earth. Their incredible journey is the foundation of our own.